المداد يا الله اسقينا بالمداد يا الله.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا محمد صلى الله تعالى عليه وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. أما بعد, to all our viewers watching, welcome to Karima Foundation. Today's live stream, inshallah ta'ala, with Dr. Yaqoob Ahmed. I'm your host, Asim Ayub. Normally there's another Asim with me, but there can only be one real Asim. So we got rid of him. One Asim to rule them all. And don't forget to, inshallah, like, share, subscribe, do all that. Make us famous as you possibly can. Spread the word, inshallah ta'ala. And get people on watching this. My guest today, I'll just give an introduction before we start, is Dr. Yaqoob Ahmed from England originally, but now living in Istanbul. He got his PhD from SOAS, and I've completely forgotten the exact name, but it was something to do with the role of the ulama in the 1908 constitutional crisis. I didn't even look this up. I'm just doing it off the top of my head.
Alhamdulillah, I'm glad you remembered.
And he's an Ottoman historian. He's taught at Istanbul University. I'm probably mispronounced that. Turks, please don't kill me. But also he's currently a professor of Ottoman history and teaches Islamic history at Istanbul University. And I just, on a personal level, from those who know him, who've experienced him, Dr. Yaqoob is somebody his classes are actually life-changing, and they give you a massive different perception on things that are happening in the world right now, and they give you an incredible confidence as a believer in Islam and the truth of the message of Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. So today, inshallah, we'll be talking about a very sort of a topic that's ruffled a few feathers. And it's not Liverpool winning the Premier League, even though I've heard we got a lot of Malaysians watching today, so there's a lot of Liverpool fans in Malaysia, so they'll be happy about that.
I'm a Liverpool fan, bro.
Yeah, I know. That's why I mentioned it.
30 years. As long as I have Sofia been in a museum.
Maybe a bit, not as long. And then also, Wycombe Wanderers got promotion. That's a more local.
Okay.
So, but speaking of changes and transformations that have taken place, unexpected happenings, something that's happened just recently is the announcement by President Erdogan that the Hagia Sofia, that has spent, I think, 85 years as a secular museum, will be returning back to its original state as a masjid built for the glorification of Allah Jalla wa Ala. And this has been massive news all over the world. Newspapers, politicians, governments, everybody's got something to say, religious figures, all the way up to the Pope himself. And all over the world, Muslims are either galvanized or embarrassed. And Allah knows best why that is. But the Ummah seems to have suddenly stirred after years of being very silent. There's something happening that has woken the Ummah up. And even though this is something that's a historical event that's linked to things that have happened centuries before. So I just want to start off by asking why do you think everybody's getting so excited all of a sudden over something that's got its roots so far behind us?
Assalamu alaikum. It's a good question. You would have to ask the question, where do Muslims place themselves in the world right now? To some degree, there is a feeling amongst Muslims in various parts of the world of struggling to place themselves in the global hegemonic worldview, which is secular, which is dominated by the Western powers. And Muslims either living in Western countries or even living in non-Western countries have had to place themselves vis-a-vis that. For a lot of Muslims, there is a fear or a concern that Islam or Muslims, shall I say, are struggling to safeguard their identity in this ever-changing world. This now move is a symbol of something, and we're starting to see the different emotions that manifested from Muslims vis-a-vis what it means to see a shift in a particular Muslim symbol. Those who want to see a shift towards an upward turn are seeing this as a positive shift, and those who are fearful have seen this as a negative shift. What it indicates then is that the Muslims, by and large, are I wouldn't even say polarized, but fractured to some degree of how they place themselves in going forward. There are many who want to remain in the status quo and those who want to break out of the status quo. So in this sense, this became quite symbolic of, forget the mosque itself and the issue. For me, it became interesting because it actually, for the first time, gave in my life, to some degree, in this last 10 years anyway, of using a measuring stick, of seeing where the fault lines are for many Muslims amongst themselves. And now we're starting to see something, which will be interesting because it may just agitate a discussion amongst Muslims of trying to make the fault lines a lot clearer so we understand what it means to be in and what it means to be out in regards to that context. So it's interesting. I don't think that's what the intention was in Turkey, but I think that's interesting in terms of that's what's happened around the world.
When you say like an upward shift, do you mean literally like a godly shift? Is that like a metaphor for people who are more religiously inclined or less religiously inclined? What do you mean there?
I think Muslims want to see Islam having some form of representation. And they have felt that there has been a series of defeats, whether it be political or intellectual or emotional, in the last 100 years since the collapse of the Ottomans. The creation of the State of Israel has been problematic for Muslims. The invasion of the war in Iraq, that what's happening in Muslims around the world is whether it's Uyghurs in China or the Rohingya in Myanmar and so forth, or parts of Africa, you can see that collectively there's a problem. And even in the West, there is a fear by many Muslim parents and so forth that their children are being lost to a particular ideology or worldview and they can't save them. So Muslims naturally, instinctively are looking for any moment of victory, whatever that may be, and turn to that and say, you know what, okay, we have something to grab onto here. And on this occasion, it's interesting how the Hagia Sophia question has galvanized a group to at least have an imagination that something is possible. Now, I don't believe that was the intention of the Turkish Republic. And we still have to be quite careful because right now we're riding a wave and in a couple of years' time, something may not manifest from this. But what I find interesting is the possibility of imagining. That's what this did. It created a possibility of an imagination that maybe the status quo can be shifted, because nobody ever imagined in this particular period that Hagia Sophia could have turned back into a mosque, and that was taken out of the imagination. And what's interesting is now that it's being put back onto the table as something of the imagination, it's been heavily smashed so that it becomes a damp squid. So it's intriguing in that sense, how this is playing out for me in that sense, in terms of this is not just about Hagia Sophia, this is about Muslim sentiment, emotion, and how they place themselves in the world they live in, and how they can imagine the possibility of what Muslims may look like and Islam may look like in the future.
One of the things you spoke about there, so this idea of the imagination. So with this decision, I love this idea that you said the fault line. Suddenly now people's truths are being unveiled. So there's people now, where do you stand on this issue? Sort of shows who you really are as a believer and what your imagination of Islam really is. And one of the things we've seen here is a lot of people trying to use their Islam to delegitimize the veracity of this decision. But ultimately, I think every argument will come back to history. And I think what we'll do, in order to open up that discussion on whether, because there's so many arguments around this, around was Ataturk right to change it to a museum in the first place? Was Erdogan right to change it back to a masjid? What did Fatih do, etc., etc.? So if we go right back to the beginning, who is this Hagia Sophia, and why is he so important?
Well, before we even start that, I mean, the point I wanted to make as a historian is finally we're starting to see, or the point that I've been making to many young people as I've been teaching, is that history is ideological. And we now start to see how history is being used as an instrument. Not only is history being used as an instrument, Islam is being used by an instrument by the various factions, actually. And what we're starting to see, and I want young Muslims to pay attention when they're reading the mass media, and I'm not just talking about newspapers, but social media, Twitter, and all of these things, how public opinion is being generated. And it's very emotive in the manner in which public opinion is being generated, where the discussions are not really intellectual discussions. They're quite intellectually immature, but what's being done is an emotion is being created. And that is interesting for me in terms of how that's working. So what you see is that the fault lines keep moving, right? Or the goalposts keep moving, but the emotion remains the same, that it should be one of embarrassment from the perspective of people who are not happy with the decision. Now, the people who are happy with the decision, they're just, consolidating their position and saying, we really don't care. So once again, I mean, the issue of the building has so many layers to it, but the layers are not being explained. What's being explained is, emotive language is being used, such as, you should be embarrassed of yourself. This is disgusting. I don't care about Fatih. I care about Umar bin Khattab. Do you really care about Umar bin Khattab? Those people that are claiming that people that care about Umar bin Khattab, I mean, where do you stand on many of the other issues that Umar bin Khattab was standing? So this level of hypocrisy from the liberal elements of wherever they are, I think that really needs to be called out to some degree. And I think if they want to have an honest debate, then the honest debate should be happening within the Muslim communities, not plastered all over the newspapers around the world to humiliate Muslims into feeling that, either or, that this is where the decision should go. So my concern is that for a long time, conservative Muslims have been accused of being idealistic and nostalgic. And yet liberalism's idealism and nostalgia is equally dangerous. And that's what we're seeing right now, which is a nostalgia of some sort of liberal sentiment or liberal zeitgeist in terms of, this is not what Islam is, this is what Islam is, or this is what Islam ought to be, which is, you're doing the same thing that you're accusing conservatives of doing. So here, my position is quite simple. Let's just break this all down. If you're going to do this debate, do it properly and give the Muslims the information they required and where it is that you have the problems. Because at the moment, do you have a problem that secularism is being lost? Or do you have a problem that, Christians in around the world are going to be marginalized because this is going to affect them? Or are you upset because Muslims who live in other parts of the world are going to be affected by this? Or are you upset because Turkey should have asked us before? I mean, the arguments keep shifting and moving. It's quite intriguing for me. But as I said, the emotion remains the same. So here, there is a problem in the way that history has been instrumentalized. And I think that's why I've always made the case, and I continue to make the case, that Muslims need to work harder in terms of studying their history, so that at least they know where they stand, in that sense. And at the moment, they're being made to feel embarrassed. And I think that's interesting for me, because if you're going to feel embarrassed about this issue, there's a million and one issues you can feel embarrassed about. And if that's going to shake the foundations of your faith, of Islam, then we're in trouble.
No, of course, no, that's a very valid point. But now you've spoken about the layers, right? There's layers that we need to unpack. And I think a good place to start is the usage of the Hagia Sophia, or even if you don't start with the Hagia Sophia, but the Byzantine Empire itself, the placement of Constantinople within the Byzantine Empire, and then the position of the Hagia Sophia within Constantinople. What did the Hagia Sophia symbolize? What does Constantinople symbolize? And then beyond that, what does the Byzantine Empire itself symbolize pre-Islam, or even at the outset of Islam?
I mean, there's no doubting that the Eastern Roman Empire, to some degree, has created a significant space for itself in what we would call Rumeli now in Ottoman context, in this area of what is Rum. And in that sense, one has to admit that the construction of the Hagia Sophia, as they call it, was a significant structure for the whole of Christendom to recognize that, this is something that we can achieve, and this is something that represents our interest as us.
Whenabouts is this?
Oh man, the dates. I'm not that tight on Byzantine history, but I can't remember. Did we remember? Did I say the dates of when was?
Oh no, not the building itself, but the whole Byzantine Empire. Where are we talking in terms of Islamic history? So this is just before the coming of the Rasul alayhi salatu wasalam, about 500, 600 years before.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, what I'm saying is that to build a building of that nature is significant. And what's interesting is the importance of that entity and that empire, to some degree, for Islam to come to that empire. That makes a major shift in Islamic discourse. You cannot imagine what it means you can't compare any other conquest, to some degree, of a Christian domain to the conquest of Istanbul, because Istanbul was a major empire of a significant proportion. And when the Muslims arrived, the majority of the peoples at that time are Christian. So, it's a huge shift in the mindset of how Muslim, non-Muslim interactions take place at the time, in that context. But people often forget there are inter-Christian contestations that are taking place in this period. And many Christian principalities, whether they're Armenian principalities or Balkan principalities, or the Latin Church in particular, are supporting various principalities to take on the Byzantine state or the Eastern Roman state in that sense, right? And Ottomans were supported on many occasions by some of these Christian principalities to go after it. So one of the things that we notice is that Fatih had already established a relationship with the Christian patriarch in 1432. You know, the Orthodox patriarch. That's prior to the conquest in 1453. So he's already have relationships with the center, and he's already sending people out there to sort of make the claim that because they had encircled it in. So one of the things that I find interesting is that the Orthodox Church was in decline, rapid decline actually, and the empire was in rapid decline in that context, and that is something that's not been spoken about. And okay, Fatih's conquest, and we can go on about that later. But the reimagination of Christianity is really interesting. What's happening right now,
in terms of like the Byzantines, you mentioned this idea that they were in massive decline at this period in time, but for them, the Hagia Sophia is like the iconic centerpiece of Eastern Christian identity, and then just before, and then it's at the time that Sultan Fatih conquers Constantinople in 1453. I read recently that Constantinople itself was massive decline. It lost massive swathes of inhabitants. The Christians themselves had attacked the city of Constantinople prior to Fatih's conquest, about 200 years before him, where they literally destroyed the city, stole its wealth, dishonored the women. It was just a horrific enterprise. And then on that basis, Sultan Fatih, and even in terms of the Byzantine Empire at that time, there was a lot of excessive taxation, abuse of its own citizens and stuff. And then at that point, Fatih makes the grand conquest of Constantinople. So, I mean, what did the conquest of Constantinople mean specifically to Fatih at that time as Muslims, because of Rome and all of that? And then how important was the Hagia Sophia as a building pre-Fatih's conquest? And then we can even talk about why he then did what he did with it.
I mean, there's no doubting that the building was the supreme center of that particular Christian church and that empire. I mean, it's a supreme building. I mean, even now, I mean, the building is phenomenal to see what was constructed in that period of time and what it represented. And it did represent not only in terms of Christianity as a religion, but a particular political power, not only for itself in terms of self-representation, but to the Christian world in terms of competing with other Christian dynasties at the time, to let the other Christian principalities know that actually, like I said, it's the Eastern Roman Church. So it's actually competing with Rome in itself, in making the case that as a center of Christianity, breaking away from Rome to some degree, that it has a significant place in Christendom. Okay, and then obviously we see the sort of like crusaders in themselves who pillaged the city on many occasions and trash it, and from that moment onwards, you see the city's in decline. I mean, from the historical perspective, many people have made the case that Justinian as an emperor wasn't such a bad emperor for his people. And it's irrelevant for us to go into the idea of whether the Byzantines were good or bad. In the end of the day, the nature of the politics of the time was one of conquest and one of expansion. And Fatih was expanding his development in his state. He had already made humongous gains in the Balkans and surrounded Constantinople, and the Ottomans had tried before.
But to an extent, there is an argument that the Byzantine Empire was always agitating the Ottomans, causing rebellions, causing revolts, attempting to
that wouldn't surprise me. That's the nature of politics. That's the nature of status quo. That's exactly what you would do as a way of making sure that an entity which is rising around your midst, that you try to be disruptive towards it because you're afraid of what's going to happen. So, I mean, that's politics. I'm not surprised that the Eastern Europe Roman state would have done that. It's just not beyond me in that sense. But Fatih had ambitions, and different historians play it differently. Analgic says that this was a supreme conquest for him in terms of Fatih was driving towards Constantinople. He was the one who wanted Constantinople. Others like Kate Fleet turn around and say that it wasn't that significant for Fatih in that sense because he had conquered everything else around him and it was only a matter of time for him. So it's difficult to know because, I mean, how would we know?
One of the things there, when you talk about Fatih and what it meant to him to conquer Constantinople, I think it would be good to mention, obviously, we know Fatih as a very godly man, a pious man. His sheikh was Shamsuddin, and also very important is the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, لا تفتحن القسطنطينية, that Constantinople will be conquered, فنعم الأمير هذا الأمير ونعم الجيش هذا الجيش, or كما قال, that what an amazing leader will that leader be and what an amazing army that army will be. So Muslims were continuously in an attempt to take Constantinople in order to be the manifestation of those words of Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam. But Fatih is the one who finally...
So it comes down to how we view the Hadith of Rasul Sallam itself. If the Hadith of Rasul Sallam is irrelevant to most Muslims, then I don't know how it works for them. I mean, so the point that some historians are trying to make is that Fatih wasn't driven by this Hadith. It's difficult to know whether he was or he wasn't, but he was the person who reflects that Hadith to some degree in the minds of the Ottomans later anyway. He's the one who conquered Istanbul. It's irrelevant how Fatih felt for them. Fatih was the one who did it, and he should be venerated for that. He should be praised for that. So that in itself is worthy in the sense that Muslims later on saw Fatih's conquest as being important. And they placed Fatih within that context because it became something of a truth to some degree. Fatih was the person who achieved it. So, and this is something that Muawiyah had been trying for a very long time. So it probably was in the Muslim imagination for a very long time to attempt to achieve, to finally conquer Istanbul, Constantinople, and Fatih was the one who achieved it. So, and there's not, his troops must have been driven by not simply booty, but definitely the idea of Islam.
I was reading the paper that you sent me where after the Imam, the first Jumu'ah that's done in Istanbul, which happens to be done in the Hagia Sofia, and then the Imam recites Inna Allah wa malaikatahu yusalluna ala nabi, the verse of salawat, and everybody breaks down that there's massive reaction that they have brought to life the prophecy of the Master of the Universe, Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, and it's so very important to them that happened. But
and I want to make it clear, just quickly, the reading I gave you was Halil Nalcik. Okay, so it's just for your readers to understand, the people that are online here, not some sort of I don't want to, because this is what happens. We get accused of sending Muslim propaganda. This is not what we're doing here. Actually, the scholarship is from a tight Ottoman historian who's known as a renowned historian of Ottoman history in this country.
Sultan Fatih takes Constantinople. He now wants to build this grand Islamic capital for his Islamic empire, and he chooses, and in the process of doing that, he then transforms the Hagia Sophia into a masjid. The salah will take place. He builds awqaf around it. Everything is sort of centered in Istanbul, I'm assuming, in his time at the very least, around I think it's the Masjid of Sayyidina Abu Ayyub al-Ansari and also the Masjid of the Hagia Sophia. I mean, because I know there's a big psychological argument here. What I'm going to say next is the nature of conquest itself, because a lot of people are claiming that he entered Constantinople. It was a Christian city, and they always go back to the example, because I've heard people say this, that why should we take the example of Fatih and how he treated the church of the Hagia Sophia, formerly the church of the Hagia Sophia, if we have a precedent of Umar ibn al-Khattab, Sayyidina Umar. So Sayyidina Umar, as we know, enters Jerusalem as a conqueror with the treaty of the Patriarch of Jerusalem, and he sort of lets the Christians keep their places of worship as they are. He refuses to pray in their churches. The Muslims wouldn't do anything to disrespect them afterwards, etc., etc. So there's this whole thing that Sayyidina Umar did such and such, Fatih did this, Fatih has fallen short of this, and is it like some sort of sinner, what he's done is wrong? What's the difference between Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu ta'ala anhu and Fatih rahimahullah?
I think the analogies are false, and I think they're problematic to some degree. By the way, just to highlight, Umar ibn Khattab built a mosque next to the Holy Sepulchre. So maybe he didn't, take the churches. But the difference between Umar ibn Khattab and Fatih's conquest was that the Christians had surrendered. Once again, the reading I gave you was there's a difference between, in conquest culture, there's a difference between surrendering and absolute conquest. And Nalcik makes this point, that Fatih's conquest of Istanbul is absolute conquest. He sent, on 3 separate occasions, he asked the Byzantines to surrender, and they refused to surrender. And so in the culture of conquest culture, when there is a idea of surrender and the population surrenders, there's terms that can be done, that can be signed in terms of the conditions of the surrender. And in the case of Umar bin Khattab, it was a surrender, And so they surrendered under the basis that their churches and places of worship would be safeguarded. And Omar did that. But once again, Omar bin Khattab built mosques close to those churches. So we're forgetting something in that sense. So we shouldn't assume that Omar wasn't politicized in that sense. But a better analogy, which people don't do, by the way, because they see it as an issue of Islam and Christianity and paganism, is Fath al-Makkah. Fath al-Makkah is a better analogy, because Fath al-Makkah was when Rasulullah came to Makkah, the Quraysh had to stay in their homes. They weren't allowed to leave. And Rasulullah walked into the Kaaba, destroyed all the idols, made it, Islamized it once again, and asked Bilal to go on the top and do azan. And when you see Hagia Sophia, in terms of the narrative that's been presented, it's a lot closer to Fath al-Makkah in some ways. It's unique and different, don't get me wrong, but in the sense that Fath comes into Istanbul, takes the city, and takes the Hagia Sophia, and it comes down to whether Hagia Sophia is part of the booty of the Sultan or the booty of the Ummah, because in the end of the day, he took the empire. He took everything. He was now the one in charge. There was no Byzantine Empire anymore, or Eastern Roman Empire in that context. And Fatih took the symbol of Christendom because there was no longer the symbol of Christendom. And politically, for Fatih to allow the symbol of Christendom to exist in his Islamic domains would have been so problematic, politically speaking. Why would he allow that to happen? So the Christians had they probably had three ways that they could deal with this. The first one was that they could take care of the upkeeping of the building themselves. It's an expensive building. They couldn't upkeep the building. The Orthodox Church was in decline. Okay, then the Muslims could have kept the upkeeping of the building for them. Why would the Muslims are under no compulsion to do that for the Christians? They just had conquered their empire. Or outside Christian forces would have taken care of the building and got involved in Ottoman matters and got involved in Christian matters. And none of these policies were acceptable. So what happens is Fatih basically takes the building. Now the question is, and the difference in the fiqh is that did Fatih take it at least 1/5 in regards to his booty, or was this the booty of the Ummah? This is the difficulty. There are narratives saying that some soldiers tried to pillage the building and Fatih refused and didn't allow them to pillage it by saying, this is mine, it belongs to me. And then after he dies, he writes a will saying it now belongs to the Ummah and the Waqf. Others make the case that we can't substantiate that information. But what's also interesting, and I want to add, is that Inalcik makes the case that Fatih then starts to use a culture which is called istimalet. Istimalet is a Turkish word. I guess in Arabic it's istimala. I'm not sure. But the idea is that he's given concessions to the Orthodox Church. He's given them money. He's given them, property. He's given them generous promises to win the non-Muslim population over, because he's just conquered their empire. And by doing so, what Fatih does, which is quite unique, is he strengthens the Orthodox Church and allows the Orthodox Church to flourish. And as his domains is centralizing in Eastern Anatolia and the Balkans, the Christian Church is also using that network to extend its influence at a time where it was very weak. And Fatih knew this. And so Fatih elevates the Greeks to some degree. And the Greeks were happy with this and satisfied with this. And they accepted that the small price to pay was the loss of their church, because at the time, the Muslims didn't have a place to pray. It became the monumental symbol. So, I'm not trying to justify anything. I'm just explaining what happened. It is what it is. Now, if Muslims feel uncomfortable by that conquest history, they're going to feel comfortable about a lot of things in that sense. And this is what part of the problem, which is to moralize a 21st century agitation of an issue which goes back 500-600 years. And then once Fatih is building his devlet, and the reason why this becomes important is because some people say we don't need another mosque in the city. But Hagia Sophia was the mosque in Istanbul. It was, every single mosque is built on this building. Every single mosque is modeled on this building because that's the first building they had. And that was now a symbol just that we've arrived. And the difference between Fatih's conquest and say what happens in 24 is that in 1924 or 1931 is that Fatih is letting Europe know that we're here, the Muslims are coming. Whereas the Turkish Republic is saying we're going to stay in our lane and we're not going to do anything. So you got to understand how the Muslim agitation is here regarding this narrative. So I think people need to read a bit more in terms of what happened here in terms of Fatih's conquest. Just after Fatih, one more thing that happens. In the 16th century, Muslims are now expanding into Greek Orthodox areas, and Muslims are asking the Sheikh al-Islam that can they take the churches to build mosques, and the Sheikh al-Islam gave a fatwa that they cannot do that. So the idea that, you know, that Muslims went on a rampage taking churches is not actually true. It was, you know, a fatwa. And this is once again in Aljic's work in regards to the, and everything I'm explaining is coming not from my own head in that sense. So I think people need to be a little fair. And what they're doing is they're trying to undercut Fatih, almost making it look like this was theft. And I think that's problematic. If that's what they're implying, that Fatih stole the building, and that now all of a sudden we've got like some sort of consciousness 600 years later to be able to give it back and share it as a kind gesture because we're very kind Muslims. I think is yeah, you need to take a long, hard look at yourself and your own consciousness in terms of how you're looking at the past.
If you step back from modern Muslim moralizing, I mean, just go into Hanafi fiqh, because that should be the centerpiece of trying to understand it and how the Ottomans dealt with a lot of the things, because they were very Hanafi, and that's why a lot of Hanafis have a strong appreciation for them. You'll say there is obviously in Hanafi fiqh you have this option of when you do da'wah ila Islam, you call the people, when you invade a territory, you invite them to Islam. If they refuse, you invite them to the jizya. If they refuse, I read it yesterday. Fasta'in billah falyuqatil. You ask Allah for assistance and you go ahead and fight, because that's the nature of what's left. And any conquest now is now in the hands of the Amir, and he does whatever he feels is best for the Ummah. That's his purview to do so. So we see what Fatih, and that's why they will mention in the Hanafi fiqh text that Sayyidina Umar felt that it was best for the Ummah for the churches to remain maintained in certain cases. And then Fatih felt here, we will say as Muslims, under his purview to do whatever he wanted to them. He could have done anything to that city that he wanted. He decided to be good to the people. He decided to allow them to continue worshipping. He had a good relation, and all he did was took the Hagia Sophia and converted it into a masjid. On that note, also,
Say something. Are you okay? I think we're losing your internet.
yeah, I don't know, my internet's playing up.
It's okay.
Let me just.
We're doing all right, I think.
Okay, I'm back.
Yeah,
but just in terms, I saw a picture of the Parthenon as a masjid. So
Yeah.
was there a culture of we would take their states, but and there was a certain type of building that would be taken as a masjid rather than just willy-nilly, because the Parthenon is again another symbol. And then at the same time, there's a maintenance that takes place, that we look after the building and we appreciate the heritage of the people who we've conquered.
I think the Parthenon and Hagia Sophia are not comparable in some ways. I mean, it for different buildings, different things happened. I mean, firstly, the point you make about, I mean, Fatih didn't want to loot the city. He didn't want to, this was his city now. Why would he want to trash it? And the people in the city were non-Muslims, and he recognized that, you know, and so Fatih wanted to come across as the benevolent leader. And, you know, he takes the most significant symbol because he's going to work around that symbol and do what's necessary in that context. But a lot of the churches that were converted in the mosques later on is because of the movement of the Christian populations outside of those areas, and so Muslims took them over and then turned them into places of worship. Other parts of the Ottoman domains, like the Balkans, they vary because it just varies from area to area and different reasons, so they're not always comparable in that context. But the Hanafi fiqh point you make is important, because in some ways there's an assumption that the early Ottomans didn't understand Hanafi fiqh and they were just doing what they wanted. But what we're starting to realize, I think what this conversation has done, and I'm happy about it to some degree, is trying to look at the Ottoman or Fatih's conquest of Istanbul from the prism of Hanafiism, and saying, oh, okay, hang on a minute, what they're doing this, and this, and this is what the Hanafi school says, and maybe they understood Madhab Hanafi a lot better than we're giving credit for, you know.
And also then, I don't want to go into this right now, but then there's also the argument that if there's precedent in Islam and then precedents in Hanafi fiqh, then maybe your problem isn't with, you know, the decision as such, it's your understanding you don't like Hanafism or you don't like Islam, because that's another discussion that we'll do, that we'll have to maybe flesh out as we come along, inshallah ta'ala. At the same time, we have and I don't know if this is because a lot of the time when this argument has begun, and people are like, oh, you know, Sultan Fatih did such and such to the Hagia Sophia, people now bring this into some sort of Western historical hypocrisy. Is that you guys took over lands from the Muslims, conquered the territories, and then there were masajid there. There's the former Ottoman territories. When, for example, when the war in Bosnia happened, I think there was an effort to destroy the Mostar Bridge, Ghazi Khosrow bin Masjid. There was also, I saw a picture recently of a masjid, former Ottoman masjid in Hungary, that was being used to store elephants. And then, of course, the Greek destruction of many of the masajid. And then Iqbal's favorite one, Iqbal always talks about the Masjid of Cordoba, that used to be the mosque cathedral. I mean, there's two things there. Number one, what is the Western hypocrisy in that? So can we flesh out Western hypocrisy? Also, the second thing there would be, why do we should we be having to resort to these arguments in the first place, or is this just a sign of, oh, we need to argue in their language, on their terms, in a way that they understand, rather than trying to prove it from, like Hanafism says, Radul Mukhtar says, the books of fiqh say, we don't care what you say. So on the two-pronged thing, so what is the historical narrative on terms of Muslim masajid being treated by Western powers, and at the same time, why should we resort to their arguments to try and prove it that you guys did it too, as if like...
I mean, in the first point, I mean, those are realities. That's what happened, okay? But and in the end of the day, I mean, we can call that Western hypocrisy and this, that, the other, but I'm not surprised that these things happen. Now, why are Muslims making this argument is because to some degree, Muslims feel quite uncomfortable with the fact that they can't legitimize or they can't defend the decision of what's happening in the Hagia Sophia. So they now have to explain all the other places where the mosques were taken apart and so forth. And in that context. And I don't know if these conversations are helpful to some degree, because what they do is they make comparisons to realities that are not comparable at times. The Hagia Sophia situation is not the same. In the Hagia Sophia, the argument of the Hagia Sophia is that once it became a mosque, it always remained a mosque. And what we're doing is we're making the argument that if a building is a museum, because it's become secularized, it's objective. And so it's neutral. And once it becomes neutral, it's for everybody. And so we live in this world of sort of like, that is a better precedent than the idea of using it as a place of worship, because we go back to the idea of the clash of empires and so forth. And that, you know, religion is dangerous, wars happen in religion and blah, blah, blah. The Cordoba analogy is probably the closest in that sense. But that's what we got. But the Babri Masjid analogy is problematic. That's not the same in any shape or form. The idea that, you know, the Hindus took down the mosques and we're doing the same. That we're not doing that. We've never done that. You know, we haven't torn these buildings down, or we're not doing it right now. So I don't know what the point is. I mean, Hagia Sophia that's not being done to Hagia Sophia. So what I'm starting to feel or realize to some degree, in my personal opinion, is that I think Muslims have become so defensive because they feel the need to defend Islam, and they feel the need to defend their position because they're continuously defending their existence and their acts and actions that they take, because they're being pounded by the right and the left. And as a result of that, they have to justify Islamic actions, when what they should be doing is understanding their tradition better and saying this is what it is. And they should be speaking from their tradition. They should be speaking from the language of their tradition, which they're not doing. So this inferiority complex is kicked in. And then the finger pointing begins. Well, you did this to us, so you can't say, you know, we're doing such and such. I don't think that's necessary. I don't think we need to go down that direction. I think we have to be bold enough and brave enough, at least now, as a newer generation, to be able to look at things in a more nuanced manner. If they're not happy with the decision that took place by the Turkish Republic, then we can have that discussion in regards to the political ramifications of that. That's different. But to go back in time and try to flesh out things that you have no reading of, I think is slightly problematic.
Just to finish off on the Fatih point, because we spent a lot of time with Fatih, this argument that people have started bringing out, the Waqf document, or he paid for it, or he bought the masjid, and such and such. I mean, is there a basis to that, or is that again an argument that does not need to be made?
We can't prove it either way, and it's just speculative. And once again, we're speculating that he bought the building because we don't want to come to terms with the idea that this could have been absolute conquest because we feel uncomfortable. There are narratives, and Inalcik makes this point again, that Fatih gave concessions and he paid out of the kindness of being the conqueror by saying, I'm your emperor, I'm the ruler here now. And that's why I said that Fatih gave a lot of concessions to the non-Muslim communities at the time because he didn't want to marginalize them. And if that's happened and people are using that that culture as a way of suggesting that he bought the building, I mean, I don't know, why would the Christians sell their building to him? I mean, that's their most powerful symbol. Why would they do it? There's no need for them to do it in that sense. But once again, I'm also speculating the counter argument. So the whole thing is speculative. And if it's speculative, then I don't think it's helpful either way. But there are documents flying around saying, you know, this is what happened. And I think we have to be a little bit careful in that context as historians and just say, look, this is what happened. It is what it is. And okay, fine. You know, the reason why it's making people uncomfortable is because currently the Turkish Republic used the notion of Fatih saying that it was in his will that this building could not be turned into and it should remain a mosque until the end of time, right? So this is why now people are trying to go back to Fatih and undercut him by saying, well, actually, this is what he did and it didn't belong to him. So what we should do is we should go 50-50 on it, which is interesting that's happened in that way. And that narrative has come out.
In terms of, because if he's the Hanafi fiqh, based on Hanafi fiqh again, if he's the ruler, he controls all the land. So in a sense, he's buying the building from himself, which doesn't really make any sense anyway.
Well, exactly, this is the thing. And so some people are making the argument that he did buy the building for himself and then he gave it up to the Muslims. Other people are making the argument he took it as booty and he then gave it to the Muslims. You know, and he took it as booty because he felt that if it was left in the hands of the Muslims, they would have pillaged it and destroyed it. So instead, he took it as a personal responsibility of the Sultan and the Amir and the Imam and makes it his. Once again, these are all traditional arguments within the fiqh. I guess Muslims need to start looking at these things in their own context so that they can feel comfortable in terms of how they place themselves. But in Turkey, this is not a big problem. This is a problem that's being pitched from the outside, which is interesting for me to see that.
In terms of one last thing now before we come to your area of expertise, I've made you stay all the way back in the Middle Ages for so long, and we're going to come from modern Turkey, inshallah, very soon. The Qurtuba, the example, one of the brothers has put a decent question, and I think this is worth fleshing out slightly. He says, why has the conversion of Masjid al-Qurtuba into a cathedral been problematized if taking over the symbolic buildings of conquered lands the norm back in the day? I don't want to try and answer it, but could it be because their motivations for doing so were entirely different? Because what Fatih did in Istanbul is not what the Reconquista did in Cordoba.
I mean, we could make those analogies or those examples, but in the end of the day, I mean, it's still very difficult to, you know, you can still flesh it out and people will find ways of trying to make them as a similar argument. So that's what happened. I mean, it is what it is in the end of the day. I mean, I can't really, you know, give an answer to that, I'll be honest. Moving
forward now.
Yeah.
We're going to fast forward a lot. But we come to I think actually we'll flesh out a point that you mentioned in the pre-chat.
Yeah.
What is the relationship before we come to Ataturk and the fall of the Ottoman Empire, from Fatih's conquest all the way till, because you mentioned something about the 19th century before when we were talking, Sultan Abdul Majid, for example. How did the Muslims treat the Hagia Sophia? And what was their relationship with it? Well,
I think a lot of people are not understanding the current move in Turkey because they're not understanding 19th century history, actually. And it's the 19th century that's been undercut here to go back to Fatih's period, to go back to a period which is far more murky in people's memories, because the memories of the 19th century are far more fresh and are far more problematic.
Painful.
Exactly. And in the 19th century, Hagia Sophia was known as a mosque. It was Hagia Sophia Jami al-Kabir. That was its name. Okay. So by then, in the imagination of Muslims and in the imagination of Christians and in the imagination of everyone else, this was now a mosque. There was no imagination that we're going to get it back one day and turn it back into a church. It was over because nobody would have imagined the Ottoman state to collapse that shape. So by then, I mean, what's interesting is the ulama for 500 years said absolutely nothing about this so-called theft by Fatih. They accepted that this was the Jami, and this was the prime Jami. It was the most monumental Jami in the whole of Istanbul in that context. So people forget Mehmet Akif, who wrote the Turkish national anthem, was the khatib in that mosque, right? So the 19th century is quite unique in the sense that by the 19th century, when the Ottoman state is going through its reforms, a lot of people accuse the Ottoman state of westernizing, and yet what you see with Hagia Sophia is an Islamization project taking place in the building itself. So the calligraphy you see in the masjid, those big discs, right? They're done by Izzat Effendi, who was a mufti, and he did the calligraphy, and they put it in the 19th century during the time of Abdul Majid II to beautify the building and glorify it. And it's the point I'm making. By the 19th century, the symbol of the building has totally changed. By the Tanzimat period, this building has become, like I said, the prime mosque in the sense of the Caliphate city. The calligraphy in the dome, once again, is from Surah Nur, okay? And it's Ayah 35. And it's intriguing because it talks about Allah is the light and He's neither east nor west. They knew exactly what they were doing when they were putting this calligraphy into the mosque at that time. So a lot of people don't appreciate that the 19th century is a huge shift in the mindset and mentality of the imagination of Hagia Sophia. And from the 19th century up until now, the imagination of Hagia Sophia wasn't Fatih. It wasn't 17th century, 18th century. It was what happened in that period. In terms of now, this becoming the prime mosque of Islam. It wasn't a mosque in Istanbul. It was the mosque. It was, the building by then. And so now when you go into World War I and so forth, and then in World War I, what's interesting is when the Allied forces occupy Istanbul, right? And it's the British, the French, the Greeks, and the Italians. The Greeks have ambitions of taking the building back and saying, we're going to convert it back to a church. And it's from that imagination that the Greeks have the idea that this ought to be a church. And as a way of subduing that emotion, the Turkish Republic in the future decides to say, you know what, we're going to make it a museum. That way there are no outside ambitions and there's no internal ambitions, because they have an agitation in that context. I mean, one of the interesting stories we hear is that when the Greeks had occupied Istanbul, the Muslims were going to blow up Hagia Sophia. They said no one's going to have it, which is interesting in that sense, because it became such an entrenched symbol for them. And the point I'm making is how internalized it became as a symbol for them. So when it became a museum, understand the trauma of that period of those people. That's the trauma that they felt of turning it into a museum. So I think a lot of people sometimes miss that. They're not understanding that by that moment, at that period, there was a lot of... Now, the idea of taking the mosque out is a rumor, or if anything, but the idea I'm trying to make, or the feeling I'm trying to put forward is this sentiment that this was ours now. By that point. So that was never in the imagination. And the Greek revival, it happens after World War I. So a lot of things regarding Hagia Sophia are post World War I in the modern period. And so the whole idea now of historians trying to undercut Fatih is quite interesting in that sense, because Hagia Sophia is not now a contestation between Fatih's conquest being legal or not, but between secularism and Islam. That was the debate in this country for a very long time, which was that they took a building which was Islamic and they secularized it. So,
I noticed while you were speaking that you referred to as the Hagia Sophia Masjid. That must feel really good. Or have you always used that term?
So, I mean, in Turkey, they've always used this term. You'd be surprised. I'll give an example. So, Muslims in Turkey have always used that term. Since it was turned into a museum, the Diyanet has been choosing two imams for that mosque ever since then. Ever since then, they've been every year choosing imams for it, because for them it was still a masjid, because the side entrance had a quarter for you to pray in it. So the issue was for them anyway, that this was it had become a mosque since Fatih's period. It was now always a mosque, and that even though they made it a museum, they made it a museum on a technicality, and in fact it's still a mosque and it's going to function as a mosque, and the mosque, should maintain its mosque status. And so the Diyanet was still choosing imams, the Diyanet was still choosing muezzins. This was still happening in that context because they didn't want to lose it as a mosque from the fiqhi perspective. And what's interesting about it becoming a museum was fascinating, because they put a sign on the door in 1931 saying it's under reconstruction. And then 4 years later, it opens up as a museum. So it totally surprises people.
you mentioned this idea of 19th century conversations. And I think just before we go to this sign and the 1935 decision, let's rewind slightly. And you mentioned an incredible point about the Greek idea that the Greeks suddenly felt they had a right to it with the advent of, maybe to an extent, Greek nationalism, with the advent of modern ideas, modern imaginations, as you call it.
Right.
Suddenly now they felt like they had a right. It was no longer, it wasn't a Greek Orthodoxy or the church itself or the Christianity that had a right to it. It was their Greekness that caused them to have a right to the Masjid. But as we talk here, this late 19th century period, you said there's a lot of discussions, a lot of agitations, secularism, Islam, a lot of stuff's happening. In order to put, I think, because we need to put Ataturk into perspective, where does he come from? And where does that mindset and that whole sort of grand transformation that he, the wrenching of the soul of Islam or an attempt to do so from that land, where does that all come from?
I mean, so we start to see a movement probably in the 19th century, which is has a particular imagination of trying to replicate moments of success that have taken place in the West. And by World War I, the losses for the Ottomans were so significant that a group of military men believed that the only way to go forward was to emulate Western modes of nation-state construction. That's what they believed in. And they believed that Islam was an obstacle for that. And they believed that all the imaginations of the 19th century was problematic. And that's the reason why the Ottoman domains got themselves into the problems that they got themselves into. So once they go on their driving process of the reforms, understand what these reforms were doing. They were literally, changing everything that looked Islamic in the Ottoman domains. And what they did.
This is pre-Ataturk, right? This is post World War I.
No, this is after World War I. So once the 24, this is 24 onwards. I mean, the war period is quite complicated. I mean, you have an empire this big that shrinks to the Turkish Republic, and then the humiliation and the capitulations that take place meant that for Mustafa Kemal, he believed, and the soldiers that had supported him, that the landmass that they had attained was important for the safeguarding of the interests of Turkey as a state and the people that lived within it. And they accepted that these were the conditions we had. This was a pragmatic decision they probably made, and so forth. But then after that decision was made, after the Treaty of Lausanne, and this is interesting because the mosque is going to be opened on the Treaty of Lausanne. So how that actually fell into place is quite fortuitous, I guess, or maybe they knew what they were doing, who knows. But the interesting thing is that after that, there was a series of reform edicts that went after visible Islam and made it, it subjugated it to the state, which was didn't happen before in Ottoman history. And Hagia Sophia, as a symbol, was a reflection of that. And so many of the symbols of Islam were stripped away. And Hagia Sophia was the only mosque that got that sort of treatment. There's another mosque here, church converted into a mosque. It's called Zerik Cami. It's the second most important church in the Orthodox tradition in Istanbul. It's a jami, it's remained a jami. No one's ever spoken about that in that context. So what they did is they, like I said, took away the most powerful symbol, because Hagia Sophia, in that period anyway, was the mosque. So the agitation is that your crown jewel is what we're taking away from you. And then we're going to pacify it, neutralize it, and you can no longer have a claim over it. That's the agitation. So for Muslims, the Fatih argument is not the argument. The argument is that's what happened to us. And then there's a series of humiliations, they say, or they feel, subsequently as a result of that, continuously, not only in terms of the early Republican period, but up until today. And so that's why, for them, the idea of now it becoming a mosque again, or revoking, as they say, the museum status as being illegal, that the idea that, and the reason why they didn't revoke it before is because the ideology of the Turkish Republic would not have allowed that, whereas now the conditions are more conducive to allow it, where people are pulling together, probably gave them the opportunity to do that.
Mustafa Kemal, very divisive figure. Okay, but in terms of his move, in terms of what he did in Istanbul, he changes the capital of the Ottoman state from Istanbul to Ankara. Now, I remember when we studied this with you, you mentioned part of it is it's a militarily pragmatic decision he had to make in the context of World War I. But was there something in the back of his mind, maybe at that time even, that in order to change the imagination of the people of Turkey, they can no longer use Istanbul, the city of Islam, but this Islamic city, as the centerpiece? Instead, now there has to be a new imagination created and a sort of wrenching away of history.
It's difficult to know. What I can say is this, is that when Fatih conquers Istanbul, he Islamizes the city, right? Building masajid, madrasas, waqfs, and so forth, the absolute Islamization of the city. Initially, during World War I, as I said before, it was pragmatic to have a capital city inland because the Allied forces can't occupy it, and they occupied Istanbul. But I also am assuming that to modernize Istanbul or to de-Islamize Istanbul would have been exceptionally difficult because of the 500 years of emphasis of what's happened in the city. So instead, it then became more, I guess, it made more sense to them to just focus on Ankara as the capital city and so forth. But culturally, Istanbul has still been the cultural hub of the country. And I mean, the skyline is the skyline of the mosques, the skyline of the city. And, you know what's interesting? I don't know if you remember this, but when I was, you probably won't, when I was young in the 1990s, there used to be a prayer mat that used to be produced in Saudi Arabia. And it used to have Makkah and Hagia Sophia in it. And even in those days, there was the imagination that Hagia Sophia was the Muslim symbol of Istanbul in that sense. So, so what they did is they couldn't remove all the mosques for so forth. So what you do, you take away the most powerful symbol that you have. You take away Hagia Sophia from everyone and you put people in their place. But to de-Islamize the city would have been very difficult because you've been here. It's virtually impossible to do that. So it makes more sense just to move to Ankara, I guess, or maintain Ankara as the capital city of the Turkish Republic.
You spoke about the 1935 decision. That people, the mosque closes for four years and suddenly now it's a museum. I mean, Mustafa Kemal, pre or during World War I, Battle of Gallipoli, Ghazi Mustafa Kemal Pasha, defender of Islam, savior of Islamic interests, fighting, he helped the Senussis apparently, I think in Libya or something. There was something to do with that as well. There was this whole idea of him as the great the warrior for Allah Jalla wa Ala. And then suddenly he's like, oh guys, so how much, so two things here. So how much of a curveball was he? Like was it like a sudden, because obviously people like Mustafa Sabri and the ulama had an idea that there was something untoward, there was a nefarious undercurrent behind this guy. At the same time, and this one's a massive question, I don't know how you're going to, inshallah we'll hope, how traumatic was his period? Like what he did, to understand the Islamic empire, the Islamic nature of what people, because I look at pictures, late Ottoman periods of Albanian women in niqab, there's like Islam is literally flesh and blood for these people. It's literally so permeated within their identity, and then he does everything in his power to snip away at it. So because that's one of the big arguments now is, right, it's that trauma from that period that's playing out now again. People.
Yeah, it's a difficult one. In some ways, I think to lay the blame on one person might be too simplistic. But there is a military class who believe that the manner in which Islam was represented in the Ottoman domain. You're right. There are people in the Albanian provinces and around the Ottoman domain who women wear niqab, but at the same time, the Ottomans are very European in the way that they see their culture. They're very nuanced in that sense. What I'm saying is it's a domain which is both nomadic and cosmopolitan at the same time. But Islam is the identity of that domain. And then you have the Turkish Republic. But I think the trauma starts in World War I. Just the loss of human life, the loss of human capital, the loss of economic capital, the loss of, Makkah, Medina, Baghdad, Quds, Cairo would have been shocking. And that continuation of that trauma, it then manifests into the creation of the Turkish Republic, the collapse of the caliphate. And so for those who had the idea of the Ottomans being synonymous with the caliphate, that must have hurt immensely. And then, you've got people who are state building again. They've made the decision of state building, but they want to relegate Islam as being secondary under a secular republic. That would have hurt Muslims even further, right? And the reformations were physical, changing the way you wear your clothes. You can't wear hats anymore. We're going to close down the tekhes. We're going to close down mosques. We're going to change the language, close down the madrasas, and so forth. And on each occasion, there's no doubt that the Muslims would have felt that this is just, going after us. And then even the 6-day speech is a speech of the reforms, but reminded the nation in terms of, look, that this is what we're achieving. And for many Muslims, that would have hurt. So it's a continuation of hurt in that sense that starts from the World War I period ends up in the Turkish Republic period. And yes, there were many ulama who were very critical of that, and Mustafa Kemal, who was the leader of the state at the time, critical of him. So that's evident. But at the same time, I mean, there are a lot of people who have taken a pragmatic position, even military soldiers at the time, who made the case that, okay, this was some believed at the time that this was a temporary step, and then later on we can make the change and go back to what we wanted to go back to. Now, the Islamic sentiment of today is still very different than the Islamic sentiment of the 19th century. But there is still an agitation between this idea or this identity of what the Turkish Republic ought to be. And on many occasions, Muslims are pushing forward to give it more of an Islamic identity. And then there's been a blowback backwards and forwards, right? So as you know, the Azan was turned into Turkish, and then Menderes makes the Azan Arabic again. But then Menderes is executed by the military junta. So you have this to and fro throughout Turkish history. And that's one of the things that I don't think people are appreciating, that they don't have an understanding of Turkish history in terms of what's been going on, in terms of the military coups, the feeling that Muslims have had in terms of being marginalized and so forth. And then finally, the AK Party coming to power and representing Muslims to some degree. But even under the AK Party, there's been a neoliberalization of society to some degree, which is a global phenomenon. So there's still this to and fro that's taking place. This is what makes it complicated.
Before we come to the AK Party, and I think that's going to be an interesting topic in and of itself, Mustafa Kemal begins these secular reforms, and I'm assuming, and he has protestations. There's the Sheikh Said revolt, and other people do sort of rise up against him, and he doesn't let people speak. He's constantly pushing people down, silencing any agitators consistently, and there's a whole. Has there been? What I guess what I'm trying to say is, in terms of Islamic voices of protest between that time, or in the Turkish Republic, has there ever been a mobilization of people who are like, no, we don't want you to take off the caliphate, we don't want you to do such and such, and what was popular sentiment being like? Because that will help us understand how people are feeling today, I guess.
Well, I think the sentiment has remained for a very long time. So in the early part of the Turkish Republic, they weren't that aggressive, in fairness to them. The aggression happened in terms of they attempted a two-party system very early on in the hope, and then it doesn't work out, and then they lock down on everyone. And the argument that was made for state building, they needed to be a particular sort of like authoritarian state as a way of being able to execute their reform program. And this is not me saying this. This is Jan Zurcher, who's a Dutch academic who writes about Turkey. And he writes this in his book, which is a primer used in most universities around the world. But you can see that a lot of these symbols matter to Muslims, and Muslims continuously have the idea that Islam should have more of a say in the manner in which the choices they make, whether it be politics, whether it be everyday life, whether it be their institutions and so forth. And this has continued in so forth, but this has been a backwards and forwards. This has never been static in that sense. Muslims have memories of particular traumas throughout Turkish history. And Muslims in Turkey have memories of military coups, and they have been consistent military coups in this country almost every 10 years. This government was lucky in the last 20 years it hasn't had a military coup, but there was a military coup attempt on July the 15th. Yes, very different in many ways, but these imaginations of military coups create a particular trauma in of itself. And even in this modern period, we're underestimating what's happened in the last 5 years in Turkey. We had military coups, we had bombings, we had the collapse of Syria. We've had a lot happening in this country. So to some degree, you can understand the agitation.
In terms of Muslims speaking out, we had obviously, I mentioned the Sheikh Said revolt and other moments where Muslims tried to enforce their voice and they were constantly shut down. And then in more modern Turkish history, I think it's Erdogan, who is the mentor of Erdogan, who comes out. He's a Muslim, very clearly Muslim. But he's not able to find. I don't know. I might see. This is the thing that I have to be careful because you're the expert here, so I might completely mess this up. But he's not able to find the popular support that the AK Party has found today. And why wasn't Islam able to find that level of foothold within the democratic system in Turkey for so long?
I think Erdogan, in fairness to Erdogan, he also found a level of hope. I mean, look, let's go back to Menderes coming into power in the 1950s. I mean, the minute they had a two-party system, the minute the Turkish Republic had a proper two-party system, people voted Menderes. They didn't vote the Republican Party, which is an indication that the sentiment on the ground was something towards a party that was listening to the Muslim sentiment. And what does Menderes do? He So I give an example. The last Sultanic mosque to be built in Istanbul is Yildiz Jami, which is Sultan Abdülhamid's mosque, right? The next mosque to be built in Istanbul is in 1951 under Menderes. So look at the gap that happens. So Menderes made a lot of promises in that. So yes, he also, created boulevards and separated the streets and whatnot, and joined NATO and so forth. But what I'm making is even as early as Menderes' time, the Muslim sentiment was strong. Now, in Erbakan's period, Erbakan came into power because the Muslim masses supported him. It was a military coup that removed Erbakan from power. So you have to remember that. And so the AK Party learned from that experience, of Erbakan's experience. But he had a particular, what you could say, popular vote from a constituent which was Muslim, for sure. He had it.
From Erbakan to Erdogan. Now we have, I don't know, so I think the first Jummah will be this Friday, on the 24th.
Yeah, they're going to be the first Jummah on this Friday, so.
I guess everybody's sort of asking why. Because we've seen Erdogan come in. At the first instant, he was always very sort of, we're going to join the EU, neoliberal economic reforms. I'm going to be, mayor of Istanbul. I think it was the transport system that he really revamped. He did a lot for the people there. And then he got in, and now suddenly, I don't know, people are like, oh, now he's showing the true colors. How much of this, again, because I think you can separate the two things. There's the Muslim imagination, the Muslim memory. We can get really happy about this. But then there's also the politician that is Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who wants to stay in power. Right, so how is this? Why? To open up the biggest can of worms we possibly can, why has he done this? Why now, after all this time, where the constant shutdown, the agitations you mentioned back and forth, why suddenly now has he felt it's time to remind Muslims of that memory that they'd long maybe even forgotten?
In fact, so the simple answer to your question is that he did it because there was an opportunity to do it. Throughout Turkish history, there's never been an opportunity to do this. The conditions have fallen into place. You can almost say that the stars have aligned in a bizarre way, where there was an opportunity to take this because of pandemic, because of America being occupied and so on, politics, because of region changing and so forth. But Erdogan had always made the statement that one day, just like Erbakan had, that Hagia Sophia was going to be a mosque. And so in that sense, it's not that, it shouldn't catch us out of the blue that this was happening. For the last 5 years, we've seen movements towards it. We've seen people praying Jummahs outside. We've had Quran recitations inside. We've had even liberal academics writing articles 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago. So the possibility of making it what we call a shared project between a church and a mosque. So people had known that the sustaining Hagia Sophia simply as a museum was never going to work. It was only a matter of time. And the fact that Erdogan is the one who's the leader of the state who has the opportunity to do it, just happens to be the timing of the day. But what I want to also add to that is that to restrict this only to Erdogan is a little bit simplistic. In the past, if Hagia Sophia would have been turned into a mosque, it probably would have been a military coup. So this has the backing of many of the institutions in this country. Because today's Turkey, since July 15th, is a very different Turkey. It's a Turkey with a very different sentiment. I've spoken to people who are pro-JHP supporters here, and even they have inclined towards saying, okay, fine, they've turned it into a mosque, This is our country. People on the outside shouldn't tell us what to do. And you see the mayor of Istanbul.
Mustafa Kemal's party.
Not all of the supporters, but what I'm saying is that there are people now that are saying that, and that would have been impossible to hear in the past. I think people are not realizing that most Turks are just pulling together on this one, because this is not it's become a bit more murky and blurry. The Turkish state is trying to survive in a very dangerous neighborhood. And they can say, well, this was not necessary. And that's the argument that many people make, that this was not necessary. And this will make it more problematic for Turkey in the region. And other people in this country feel that maybe this is Turkey trying to step out the status quo and trying to do something different, and doesn't want to be shackled by the European powers, by the Americans, by what's happening in the region, and wants to fashion an own identity for itself, a new identity for itself. And the identity is some sort of Turkish Islamic synthesis. The country's changed rapidly. There's a huge Syrian population here, migration population here. There's a lot taking place on the ground in terms of Turkey's ambitions in the region.
Erdogan specifically, I think he lost a mayoral election in Istanbul not incredibly long ago. And also, there's been a slight change in the AK Party, and it's sort of the way it's packaging itself. It's now, rather than become the neoliberal party that was going to join the EU and all of that and be part of Europe, has now painted itself as a very nationalist sort of party. And then there's been an alliance I think they made with the Nationalist Party in the last election at the same time. And you're mentioning now that there are secular people even jumping on board with this. I mean, the main question I want to ask is the idea that what is the sentiment in Turkey? But at the same time, even in terms of people who are pro the decision, are they pro-Islam or is it pro-Turkness?
Yeah, and this is, so first, just to clarify, Erdogan didn't lose the mayoral elections because he's not the mayor of Istanbul. But it is true. His party lost the election, that is true. And yes, it is fair to make the case that some people thought that this was a protest vote against Erdogan as president and so forth. But what it showed is that the Turkish political system actually is a bit more dynamic than we gave it credit for. The idea that this was a dictatorship sort of goes out the window because the mayor of Istanbul is not from the party from the ruling government. So in that sense, in fairness to Turkey, I think it should be, as a country, given some credit, as being a lot more nuanced. Now, in the case of Turkey shifting, or the AK Party shifting its agenda from when it came to power and so forth, once again, that's a series of steps and moves that that party has chosen to take, depending on the changing conditions internally and externally. I'm not going to be privy to comment on that, but because my expertise is not on politics, I'm a historian. But what I will say is that right now, it's difficult to know what the sentiments are. For Muslims who subscribe to being conservative Muslims, this is a great step. For those who see it as an issue of sovereignty, they see that, okay, this is sovereignty, so be it. For those who see it as a form of Turkish nationalism, and that this is, the Turkish nation state, making its case, then that's what's driving them. What you see, what's interesting, is there's a kaleidoscope of opinions. And this is one of the difficulties here of people trying to simplify how the Turks feel on the ground. In actuality, for different reasons, people feel differently about this. And the opposition, however, some people say the opposition is not great in Turkey because, there's a fear or so forth. I haven't noticed that. The opposition is coming more from the outside as a way of putting pressure on the country. But it seems like, by and large, this is not that much of a problem in regards to the secular ideals of the Turkish Republic, as people on the outside are making, because secularism is also evolving in Turkey. So as I told you, the Turkish identity is evolving and the nature of secularism is evolving. So we're in some sort of blurry period right now. So it's very difficult to know where we're at. And it's difficult to make that analysis, is what I'm saying. So, but people want something harsh and fast. Is it Islamic? Is it secular? What I'm saying is we're in a very blurry period. And that's what's interesting in that context.
In terms of the changes, I mean, we've seen Awqaf reopening of many Awqaf. When I came and had the honor of studying with you when I was there in Turkey, I think we were at a reopened or a revamped Waqf that we studied in. Yeah. And at the same time, like you mentioned, the changing of the state, I think it was it one of the secular parties where one of their candidates was reciting Quran, in order to appeal to voters. So now Islam is back in the, sorry, go ahead.
So he's the mayor of Istanbul. So this is what's interesting here, which is one of the things that the AK Party have been accused of by conservatives in Turkey, is the fact that they've opened up neoliberalism to conservatives in Turkey. And there's a concern that there's been a drop in morality among certain core Muslims in that context. And neoliberalism is a global phenomenon. At the same time, there's an argument also being made that the AK Party have created a particular discourse that even the opposition now have to adhere to, and they will not go back to. So the idea is that the headscarf will never be banned now. It's impossible to put that on the table because Turkey's moved on from that, where even the new mayor of Istanbul is going into Ayub Jami and he's reciting Quran. You understand? So there's a lot of these sort of shifts taking place. So the argument I've made, that the way I look at Islam in Turkey at the moment, it's a jar of two lids. One lid is opening and the other one is closing at the same time. And because it's moving in that way, it's very difficult to then make analysis of where is Islam in Turkey right now, because I've said this before, what are we comparing it to? And what is it ought to be? And I think we need to have that discussion in terms of what is it we're comparing it to in terms of how it's progressed and what do we want it to be? And those sort of discussions are not taking place amongst Muslims. At the moment, Muslims are living their lives day to day.
You spoke about reactions. So there's been reactions, people are having reactions to this. And he spoke about one of the biggest agitations or the biggest protestations are not from inside Turkey, but it's people outside Turkey. And I think now we just step outside Turkey for a bit. There's been various reactions of different forms, and I think we can unpack. I don't know, I'm conscious of time, and I realize Maghrib has come in for you, so I don't want to, I don't know how long you have with us.
I have, yeah, it's okay, we can go for it, don't worry about it.
Inshallah. But what I wanted to ask you is, so we need to, because there's a few different things you have to unpack. There's been the Greek reaction, that's one, they've been very vocal. There's been Christian reaction, that's the Pope reacting. And then there's the Muslim reaction in the diaspora, especially Muslims in the English-speaking world. So I think let's see if we could do, I think we'll start with the Muslims, because I think that one's very important to us as believers. I'll bring up ISNA, so the Islamic Society of North America, their president comes out. Allah Alam, whether he wrote on behalf of ISNA, he claims he wrote as a personal writing, even though he had written president of ISNA at the bottom, which is strange. Allah Alam, we have husn al-dhan of our brother, maybe, I don't know, the wrong letterhead was used or something. But at the end of the day, there's an Islamic society that has come out and said Erdogan is wrong to make this decision, and Muslims are trying to argue against it for whatever reason. Now, is this, like you mentioned before, is this the inferiority complex rearing its head once again? And you mentioned to me when I mentioned it to this to you privately, a part of it is just Western Muslims thinking too big of themselves, as if anybody really cares what you've got to say. So on that level, how important is that the Muslims in the West are not too happy? Some prominent Muslims in the West are not too happy with the decision. And why? Why do you think that is? Why do you think Muslims are struggling to come to terms with it?
I mean, what we see in the ISNA context is a retraction. So the retraction is an indication that there is a core Muslim sentiment even in the West, which needs to have a voice. And I guess their voice is not being represented to some degree, but the voice of those who are in positions of a particular form of authority or can exercise a particular opinion, propagated an opinion, and they're doing it in a way in which it's almost working as a pressure or a proxy on Muslims in the Muslim world, which is interesting for us. People on the ground here are very frustrated to hear this sort of opinion being made by ISNA initially, because continuously Muslims have been told in this part of the world to stay out of Muslim interests in terms of what's happening in Western countries. It's none of your business. Stay out of our business, so forth. But the opposite happens, because to some degree Muslims in the West, I guess I'm assuming, one, exercise the tools of power so they can exercise it, and two, there seems to be, I guess, fundamentally a fear. There is a fear to some degree, and they're worried how they're going to be perceived locally within the neighborhoods that they interact with, and so they then need to put pressure externally and work as a pressure group, and to a state that really couldn't care less what you think. That's the reality. I mean, that's how it is here. So, okay, then should Muslims should have the right to express an opinion? They should, no doubt about it. But the interesting thing is that Muslim opinion in the West is just shifting and moving every single time. It's not static. It's almost like it's on speed, and it's not consistent, and it's agitated, and it's annoyed, and it's angry, and at times it's toxic, and it's a reflection then of the zeitgeist of the day, which is particular culture in the West in of itself. So Muslims are no different then in some ways in terms of those that are making those complaints, because they're very reflective of that, and they exercise the tools that they can have in front of them to then popularize something which I think made many Muslims in this part of the world very uncomfortable. And I don't know if we should have the right to do that. I mean, who gave us the right to do that? I mean, in the end of the day, on whose behalf? This is what I want to know. On whose behalf are Muslims in any given country speaking for? And I'd like to know that. And I think a better question should be asked in terms of, and this is me thinking out loud, is that what is it that agitated Muslims on this? Those Muslims who are agitated. I mean, what's the root of this? I think we need to get to the root of the agitation, because that in itself will tell us how Muslims feel in the West. I mean, in that sense. And I'm saying the West because I lived in the West. And I go backwards and forwards in the West. And I feel every year when I'm away and I come back, I feel a sense of an agitation. There is an agitation, and in that sense. And where's that coming from? So I think we should ask ourselves that question without being offended. You know, some people may not like the tone of language I'm using. I might be ruffling a few feathers. But if it means that people have a conversation about it, then they should do. Because at the moment, while Muslims in Western countries are doing many great things in terms of building institutions and so forth, at the same time, there's an agitation and there's a fear. And then they're projecting that on the rest of the world. And I don't know how helpful that is.
That was my next question. You literally took it out of my mouth, which was the idea that is there a sense of Muslims projecting their own insecurities as minority within the grand liberal secular religion, I guess if you could call it that theocracy. They're just feeling insecure there and they're just projecting it. It's a sort of like, I don't know if it's like jealousy, but it's just like, oh God, they're doing Islam over there and we can't really do Islam over there.
I mean, look, I wouldn't use the word jealousy. Well, my concern is that the Muslim identity has taken precedent over Islam. This is what's happened. It's survival. So it's the idea of surviving as Muslims, as a group, which has taken precedent over the izzah of Islam, by and large, which is that, you know, the uncomfortability of actually calling a spade, and this is what Islam is, in the sense that we need to survive. And I made this case, I'm making this case a lot recently, and I'll say it again, which is that the izzah of Islam doesn't diminish because people leave Islam. It's our izzah that diminishes if we leave Islam. Islam is Islam. Allah Ta'ala will take care of it. Now, if Muslims are uncomfortable with what Islam is, then they need to come to terms with what Islam is. They need to study it more, debate it more, and understand it. But if they're going to try to cajole it and bend it and twist it to make it applicable to their identity configurations, I think that's problematic. And they're actually placing their identity above Islam in of itself. Yeah, we have a situation here. And I think this is a conversation we need to have.
I mean, in terms of that, just on the back of that, there's that verse of the Quran where Allah Jalla wa Ala says that, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu man yartadda minkum an dini. The one that, you know, if people leave the faith, Allah will bring another people, yuhibbuna wa yuhibbuna, that love him and he loves them. Yujahidu wa la yakhafuna lawmata laim, people that don't care what the criticizers have to say. So even, you know, people can disparage Islam as much as they want and leave in droves, but Allah will bring people in the caravan. We'll always keep moving.
I'm a Muslim, and I have tawakkul in Allah Ta'ala, and I was always taught by my Imam when I was a young kid that believe in Allah Ta'ala's mercy, but believe in His protection first. So, you know, let's go for it. Allah Ta'ala will protect those that believe in Him.
In terms of another decision, another response that's been slightly, and I'm just going to say for the record, if people are watching this, I took this one from Wikipedia, so Allah knows best. I do need to maybe double check it. But I read that Shawqi Alam, the Grand Mufti of Egypt, which then would mean some sort of affiliation to Azhar University, which is arguably the most prestigious Islamic institution in the world, gave a fatwa saying it was impermissible for Erdogan to make this decision. Again, I've taken this from Wikipedia, so Allah knows best whether he said this or not. But again, if and there are ulama, there are academics and stuff who have come out and tried to give a fit-based justification for the delegitimacy of Erdogan's decision, or even Fatih himself. All, you know, they're trying to find some Islamic understanding for their inferiority complex, or whatever you want to call it. Allah knows best, whatever it is. How do we sort of respond to that?
Where have they been for the last 100 years? Where have they been for the last 10, 20 years? Why didn't they come out with this before? Why did they wake up this morning? It makes, you know, and, you know, as people kept telling me that I believe in the actions of Umar bin Khattab over the actions of Fatih, then I equally can make the argument I believe in the actions of Fatih over the actions of a Mufti in Egypt. You know, like, it doesn't make any difference for me in that context. I mean, the question is that, I mean, whoever is in Egypt is entitled to make a fatwa. It's an opinion, and they're entitled to the opinion, and they can put it out there, and that's great. And let us see the opinion so that I can understand. Me as an academic, I'm not an alim in that shape, but I want to see the fiqh in where it says that a museum, it is legitimate to turn a mosque into a museum, and it's haram for a museum to be revoked so it become a mosque again. Unless if the argument is being made once again that Fatih, going back in time to Fatih's conquest, that what Fatih did is illegitimate. And in that sense, I not only want to see a fatwa, but I want to see the historical reading of that period with the historical evidences going into the Ottoman archives and telling me that this mufti made that judgment, which is probably not what happened.
No, of course. again, responses. I think one of the more Greece specifically, and the Greek Orthodox Church. And I think here we can sort of open it up a bit. Erdogan announces, or the announcement has been made, and we talked about this briefly beforehand, that the first imam of this masjid will be a Bosnian. And this is, I think we're in the week of the anniversary of the Srebrenica massacre. May Allah have mercy on all the martyrs of Islam and honor them, inshallah ta'ala, and make their graves gardens from the gardens of paradise, every person who's died for the sake of Islam. He's announced that he will be a Bosnian imam. And at the same time, we saw, for example, when the Bosnian massacre was taking place. Now, Bosnia, I think, is very important, and I will agree with me, in terms of the Ottoman context, again, because it was formerly Ottoman territory that I think was without his permission forced out of the Ottoman state and placed under a non-Muslim jurisdiction. He's announced that and at the time the Bosnian massacres came out, we saw the Serbian Orthodox Church, we saw the Greek Orthodox Church honoring the murderers, honoring the people who carried out this genocide. Why, and now their reaction is one of, oh, so where can we see, so in terms of like the Bosnian, that decision that Erdogan's made there specifically to do with picking it, and I mean, as a historical narrative in terms of Ottoman history, where does that play out, and where does the Greek Orthodox Church, I mean, is it an orthodoxy, is it a Greek decision, is it a nationalist decision, and at the same time, what is Erdogan trying to symbolize by picking a Bosnian as the imam? Or is he not?
I mean, I couldn't answer that question whether the Turkish president actually chose the imam himself. What we know, I mean, the imam has been reciting in that mosque for quite a while. Whenever there's been a recitation in the mosque, it's been that imam, and he's the mosque of Yenijam here. But he's a Turk, but he's obviously originally, I mean, his parents are from Bosnia. He knows Bosnian, and the second imam is Macedonian. I'm sure that that's used as some form of symbolism, as a way of showing this mosque, Hagia Sophia, is inclusive. It's inclusive not simply to just being a Turkish mosque, but it's inclusive in terms of Muslims from around the world. And the Diyanet will usually choose an imam who is somebody who is part of the Diyanet, and that has to be somebody from Turkey. But at the same time, they chose an imam who was Bosnian, and the second one being Macedonian. Now that could be, I'm not just saying, it could be pure chance. It could be. Or it could be, instrumental. It be in that symbolic in that context. Either way, I mean, it's made people satisfied and happy, and they're realizing that this is also possible, because now Muslims in Bosnia feel attached to Hagia Sophia, and Muslims in Macedonia, the Albanian Muslims, also feel attached. And we're not asking the question of Muslims in. You mentioned Srebrenica, and the idea of Muslims in the Balkans is very interesting in terms of how they feel, in terms of what's happening regarding this symbol as a mosque, because of what's happened in the Balkans in regards to the deconstruction of mosques and the deconstructions of lives in that sense. So in terms of the Greek Orthodox Church, I mean, I couldn't answer for that, but I think in terms of the Pope in itself, I mean, the Pope had to give an answer. That's what the Pope does, and it's to some degree, I guess, the fear the Pope has is that the decline of Christianity globally is a problem, and seeing this happen is not only a problem for the Orthodox Church, it's a problem for Christianity as a whole, and with the declining numbers, and a problem for the Roman Catholic Church. So, but people forget that in the 1960s, a Pope came to Istanbul and quite cheekily prayed in Hagia Sophia to agitate, and 3 days later, Muslims were praying in Hagia Sophia and got into trouble for doing that because the Pope did it. So it's the assumption that only Muslims, or that Muslims are instrumentalizing religion is slightly unfair, because here we're seeing the instrumentalization of religion from the Greeks, from the Pope, and from everyone else, and the instrumentalization is universal.
I think the Catholic hypocrisy is more apparent than others, because obviously with the Masjid in Cordoba, they did not allow, they had the option to allow joint worship, I think, and they refused. And they have, I mean, Iqbal is famous, he prayed in the Masjid of Cordoba, but he was very unique in that sense, in that if you try to pray there, I think the security guards that will stop you from praying. And at the same time, in terms of, like you mentioned, they're praying in the Hagia Sophia in secular Turkey. And famously, it was a Catholic crusade in the 13th century, I would think it was, that destroyed or really damaged the Hagia Sophia in their attempt to go free Quds from Muslim control. They went on the way and destroyed and attacked the Hagia Sophia. And I think the Catholic Church thing is so very, very apparent.
In fairness to the Turkish Republic, I think people, there's a lot of scaremongering that's taking place. And actually, the Turkish Republic and Muslims in this country are very sensitive towards not marginalizing people being able to come to Hagia Sophia. You know, I mean, we were using it as a mosque in terms of the side. The only thing is they've opened up the main courtyard and rolled the carpet out on the front floor. And that seems to have agitated people, which is that we rather have nobody praying in it than anyone praying in it, which is intriguing as an argumentation. And you know, people here have been very sensitive towards that, which is that just like how you go into the other mosques, you can go into this one, you can still see it, you're not paying for it anymore, you're taking your pictures and you do whatever makes you happy. The only difference is maybe you might have to take off your shoes. You know, and I think Turks have been very sensitive. And like I said, Muslims have taken care of that building for a very long time. I don't think they're going to trash it or desecrate it. And if there are Muslims around and out and about who are unhappy that as a space of worship, that for some strange reason, we are not going to look after the upkeep of this, even though the house of Allah is something that we take very seriously in terms of safeguarding, then, I mean, Muslims can just take their photos from outside. And I would, you know, I'm tired because I've heard certain liberal Muslims make the case that this is unacceptable and so forth. But yeah, of course I'll come inside and take photos. No, don't do that. Hold a principled position. Your principled position should be that, you know, that you detest this totally and that you're never going to see this building ever again because you detest the fact that it's a mosque, and we can all move on. But the sentiment for many other Muslims is that, you know, they can finally get to pray in Hagia Sophia, and I can understand that sentiment.
In terms of, I think, in terms of liberal principles, I think the great principle that liberals have is that they have no principles. But moving on from that, I mean, one of the responses that we've seen a lot of the times is this idea that, oh, you know, by Turkey opening up the Masjid, or opening up, sorry, the Hagia Sophia as a masjid again, they're going to hurt this sort of global bond of love and brotherhood that we're all trying to build together, this, you know, spirituality without a religion, common love, and all the human.
Let's be real. What bond and brotherhood are you talking about? I don't see it. So this is an anathema to me. It's a lie. It's a hoax. And that's what I mean. It's the idea of creating an imagination that doesn't exist, and that the Turkish Republic, for some reason, should take the responsibility of keeping the world together and keeping everyone happy. I mean, it's not its responsibility to do that in that context, you know. And it's not a caliphate. And if it was a caliphate, you wouldn't want it anyway. So, I mean, in that sense, I mean, I don't understand where these sentiments come from in terms of it's the job and the role of the Turkish Republic to do this, or Muslims in Turkey to do this, or that Muslims in Turkey, the argument, you could have been better. You could have been better than this. You could have just, you know, I mean, it doesn't make sense here. So, look, someone like myself can critique this government and say a lot of things if we wanted to. But as far as I'm concerned, now that it's a mosque, let's just move on. Let's just move forward and, you know, get over it. And rather than just, you know, taking an axe and picking away and trying to take this country down, why don't we just like listen to the opinion of the people on the ground and move forward? And, you know, we're not trying to any shape or form agitate anyone in many ways. We're trying to be as inclusive as possible. And people say, no, but, you know, it should be a church and so forth. But, you know, I mean, the Christian population of this country is something like 0.4%. Like, what are you talking about? Now, they want a side of it to be a church. I mean, I think that's a decision of the Turkish Republic to make, not for me. And if they want to make a space for Christians to be able to come on a Sunday, that's their choice. I don't think they'll do that. They're not obliged to do that in any shape or form. And it is what it is.
I am conscious of the time, so I am going to start. So we're trying to wrap
Sure.
up soon. I have a question in terms of Erdogan, and then I think we'll move to closing remarks. We've seen, you know, Erdogan, although especially in Pakistan, these Pakistanis love their Erdogan. And I think there was that funny stuff as well, because they were so confused to see that the actors weren't really Ghazi warriors and spiritual people in real life, and Ibn Arabi maybe wasn't as spiritual as they thought he was, and they were like spamming them on. But anyways, there's been this massive...
Yeah.
Second, Doc.
Okay, we're back. It's cool.
Okay, we're back. So this idea that people are seeing now Turkey as representative of, you know, the Istanbul is once again the Darul Khilafah. People, their imaginations have been stoked. Muslims are seeing Erdogan as a leader, Muslim leader, strong Muslim in the opposite word, leader, proud of his Islam, and is really sort of, and then he, you know, when the agitations, when the war happened in Libya, he's recently intervened there. People have seen that. He's been opening the Awqaf generally. And then there's been this massive nostalgia for the Ottoman Empire as well. People, you know, Ertuğrul being one of the examples of that. I mean, the question I've got written here, and I don't know if this is going to work, but is the Ottoman Empire coming back, or people just getting a bit too excited over?
I mean, honestly, I don't think the Ottoman Empire is coming back. I think even Muslims have to be a little bit careful in terms of the imaginations they're having. I mean, the Turkish Republic works within a particular remit and has particular conditions in that context. And there's a very complicated political structure in a political society. But what I can say is that Muslims should start to have an imagination of the possibilities of anything happening in the world. I think they shouldn't be beyond that. Do I think that the Turkish president is going to be that savior of the Muslims? No, I don't actually. I mean, that's just a pragmatic analysis of what's happening on the ground. But I don't. But my personal opinion is that Muslims can do wonderful things, and I think this ummah has the ability to do something amazing. And whether Erdogan exists or doesn't exist, whether you watch Ertugrul or not, one of the things that you have to have the capacity to believe that you can make this world a better place and that you can provide an alternative. And I believe Muslims can do that. And I believe Muslims are still here and that we matter and that we're important to the world that we live in. And it indicates to some degree that Muslims require leadership. They're looking up to people who can galvanize them, motivate them, and take them forward. But Erdogan's generation is a particular generation. We need to create a new generation of youngsters who can galvanize and go forward and move on from this. I think this generation has gone as far as it can in regards to what it can achieve. And I guess the Hagia Sophia is an indication of that, which is that it's probably gone to the zenith of that generation. The next generation needs to kick on from that, whatever that may be. But we need a human investment in that sense. And we need Muslims to believe in something. And I understand the cultural soft power television shows, and I know what it does. In that sense, what was intriguing for me is that then the emotion is still there. And alhamdulillah, that the emotion is still there. We haven't lost it, which means that there's still fire in the lamp, because if they didn't have that, then I would be exceptionally worried. So someone like me as a historian can criticize Ertugrul a lot. But what I found fascinating about Ertugrul was not necessarily the show itself, but the emotion of the ummah. And so what the ummah requires is real thinkers and passionate intellectuals within their midst who can galvanize them, be trusted, and represent them and take them forward. We need more of that. We need more of that. So this is what we should be doing. And we should believe we can do this. It is not beyond us, Yan. We're here,
I think that's a perfect note to begin to wrap up. I mean, I remember there's a statement that Sheikh Muhammad Awama, who's one of the Syrian scholars living in Istanbul at the moment, quoted Mustafa Sabri, rahimahullah ta'ala, to say that as he saw the Ottoman Empire collapse in the Khilafah, he said a statement something like, the Muslim body is sick, but it hasn't died yet. And I think that's just that ray of hope that there is, believing ourselves to be people who will try to populate the earth with the dhikr of Allah, and this being another move in that direction. I just wanted to, I don't know, because I don't know my dad's got this, he's built this love of Allama Iqbal in me, and there's a beautiful line from some of his poetry where he says, he's talking about Spain and Cordoba, where he says, "Poshida teri khaak mein sajdon ke nishan hai, khamosh azane hain teri baad sahar mein." That signs of sajda are hidden in the dirt of he's talking about the Masjid of Cordoba, and there are silent calls to prayer in the air when we wake up in the morning. And subhanAllah, this is and I don't know, I want you to give the closing remarks because I don't want it to be me, but what does this mean for us as Muslims? Like, I just want to, as a believer now, beyond academia, beyond, secular liberal, as people who believe in the promise of Allah, people who believe that Allah is the Lord of the heavens and the earth, the Sayyidina Muhammad was his messenger and his final messenger. He's the most beloved person, and may Allah make it the most beloved person to us in our hearts. What does this decision mean to us?
I think for now, irrespective of what people believe, but it's evoked in the imagination. It's evoked in imagination, and in that sense, like something which is impossible has evoked the possibility of anything is possible, and that we're here, we exist, we have a voice, and that if this can happen, then finally Muslims, that the fact that Muslims they have this feeling, and it might be very short, the window might be very short for them before the door gets closed, but the fact that they have that emotion means that this is a good time to invest in Muslims and get them to run forward. I always say to people, you have Allah on your side. You have Allah on your side. Well, what have you got to fear? in that sense. And Allah Ta'ala gave you the two greatest gifts. He gave you the Quran, which is His word, and He gave you His Prophet, which is the Sunnah. So, so long as you stay steadfast to that, you hold on to that rope, then I think Allah Ta'ala will definitely, see well upon the Muslims who are trying to achieve His work, for sure. It's going to be difficult. Let's not beat around the bush. This is tough. This is what it means to be a believer. It's going to be hard. But we keep going, inshallah.
I am conscious it's your Maghrib time has come in. So, we can all see that through the window. What I will say here, I hope my community in High Wycombe, inshallah, we're going to have you down at some point, inshallah. We're planning to. You will be in the UK soon. We're going to try and host Dr. Yaqoob Ahmed for another open panel discussion, inshallah ta'ala, on Ottoman history and just general learning about history, as what history means to us as Muslims. I want to thank you.
But just to see you guys, hug you guys, pray with you guys, and be together. That's important.
Subhanallah. Just to bond as brothers. Innamal mu'min wal ikhwa. And subhanallah, I just want to thank Dr. Yaqoob for, I just want to thank you for everything, really. I don't know, that trip, that month I spent with you and other scholars in Turkey has been really life-changing for me, and I've benefited from it immensely. So I thank you. I hope everybody benefited from this discussion, inshallah ta'ala. We pray that Allah Jalla wa ala accepts our efforts. Allah Jalla wa ala makes us sincere in our efforts, and that Allah Jalla wa ala, in this, like the Sheikh has mentioned, this idea that the door has opened, there's a moment that we can take advantage of. We pray that Allah Jalla wa ala allows us to take advantages of these moments and allows us to see the honor of Islam rise once again. And on that note, inshallah ta'ala, to all the viewers, like, share, subscribe, share it with all your friends if they want to watch this discussion back, inshallah ta'ala. I hope there's great benefit in it for people. Once again, I thank Dr. Yaqoob. I thank you all for tuning in, and inshallah we will see you next time. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.